Welcome everybody to our series of lectures on ethical implication of AI. My name is Roberto Ziccari. I'm quite pleased to introduce you the guest speaker of today, Carl Mörch from the University of Montreal in Canada. That's a great thing I have in Zoom. You could have guest speaker from all over the world. We're very pleased to have Carl with us. Carl will make a guest lecture titled Design of Ethics Tools for AI Developers. As the title is telling you, we are now really looking at how can we just do practically the work of looking at ethical implication with tools. We're very pleased to have you, Carl, here, and the floor is on you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Roberto, for the invitation. I'm very happy to be able to teach this class. I have attended a few of the past classes out of curiosity, and I'm very happy to try to do something related and in connection with the other classes. So, as Roberto said, I will do a presentation on the design of ethics tools for AI developers. I will do the presentation based on my experience, based on the current work that I'm doing. As you might have seen with all the logo, there are a few mandatory steps that I have to follow. So I am a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Montreal, and I'm also at MILA, the Quebec Artificial Intelligence Institute, directed by Yoshua Benjo. I am funded by the Observatory on the Societal Impacts of AI. I have worked on the design of AI ethics tools for quite a few years now. I started during my thesis, and then during the work that I'm doing now as a postdoctoral researcher is an extension of the work that I started as a PhD student. I created a tool called the Canada Protocol. It's currently under revision by the journal Artificial Intelligence in Medicine. However, the preprint is accessible on arXiv, and like I said, I will do the presentation based partly on this, but also on the lessons learned along the way. And also I will try to talk about the challenges, the design challenges, the methodological challenges, and some of the ethical challenges that can also arise when you work on the design of AI ethics tools. If you have any question, don't hesitate to write them in the chat. And Roberto, at some point, will be able to also relay these questions to me, and so please feel free to ask questions or make comments. I'll be very happy to have an interactive session with you at some point. So as you have seen throughout the past classes, AI ethics is a very active and lively topic. It's a fairly recent field that started burgeoning in the 60s and has become more important over the past decade. If we have to sort of corner where AI ethics is, we could say it's at the intersection of technology and data ethics. Why do I feel the need to specify this here? It's because when we create an AI ethics design tool, it is also important and to keep in mind that we will have to talk about other issues, other challenges coming from fields that are not specifically related to AI. And most of the time, we also have to start with what makes AI, meaning data. AI as a field raises different types of concern and questions. And one of my colleagues at the University of Montreal, Martin Gibert, said that for him, there are a few risks related to AI. The first type of risks are risks related to stupid AI. What he calls stupid AI is a bug, bad code. But then for him, there are also risks related to an evil use of AI. For instance, if AI or an AI system is used for mass manipulation or influence, cyber attacks. And then you also have risks related to a super intelligent AI. So this is definitely science fiction. We're not there yet. The general AI is not there yet again. But we can envision with AI ethics a risk related to the rising of such super intelligent AI. Then there are also, and I think that's my favorite category, if I may say, these are the risks related to a lack of ethics, meaning nothing was done or anticipated when creating or designing an AI system. And this can be a very frequent situation, and I think AI ethics tools can address some of these risks, but maybe even more specifically the last proposition. So what's the goal of AI ethics, and how could AI ethics tools be related to these goals? For Tadeo and Toridi, that you also have heard about, AI ethics can be helpful for different reasons. First of all, it could help manage the risks related to the technology. But for them, it could also be a way to responsibly manage the opportunities. It's a cliche, and I think we have heard it many, many times, but yes, AI raises many opportunities, but also raises many concerns. So how do we find a balance, and how could we seize the opportunities while also addressing the major challenges and risks? But another and the last main goal of AI ethics for them is also it allows us as a process, AI ethics is sort of a process, to explore future questions. And when we're talking about AI ethics tools for developers, tools might be used at very different times of during the process or of the development of an AI system. And exploring future questions might be a key strategy at the beginning of a process to understand what might happen in the future. And we'll see that this last point is now embedded in computer sciences conferences guidelines, and we'll have a close look at it. So in this perspective, AI ethics tools could help, first of all, mitigate risks by providing concrete solutions. Then it could help create more sustainable AI systems, both legally and ethically. And the last one, and coming from the field of psychology, prevention is very dear to my heart, and AI ethics tools could definitely help prevent adverse or unintended consequences. As we say in psychology, 1 ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And I think when we speak about the risks related to designing a bad AI system and the consequences that could arise, or not being careful enough, mitigating the risks or the consequences is far more time consuming. It's also not a winning strategy in the long run. The question now is, when could an AI tool be useful? So there are several stages that are fairly common and that you see across different fields. An AI ethics tool could be used during the ideation stage, meaning when we are thinking about what type of AI system do we want to do, when we're just really at the most creative stage, when we're trying to think about what do we want, how do we want it. Then the second stage could be the design stage, when we are actually working on the design of the AI system. The third stage could be the prototype. When we have a prototype, maybe tools could be helpful at this stage to sort of systematize or to provide a methodology to think about unintended consequences, potential also adverse situations that could arise if we don't think about different types of topics. Then the fourth stage could be the testing stage. And as you know, probably sometimes way more than I do, the testing stage for when you design an AI system is key and crucial. And I think AI ethics tools could be very helpful at this stage to help developers be thorough and methodic, and also maybe equipped when dealing with potential ethical considerations. We could cite, for instance, the need to have unbiased data sets And maybe when we trained our system in order to prevent large-scale errors or mistakes or discriminations due to the lack of consideration during the test phase. Then we have the deployment phase. When we deploy the tool, we're sure that we, for instance, include all the targeted populations if we have a large-scale AI system. So this stage can be crucial because the potential impact of an AI system at this stage can really be seen, and it can be very important to maybe have some guidelines or structure to know what to do in case something ethically challenging happen. And then the dissemination stage is when, after the deployment of what used to be a prototype, now the dissemination stage is really when it's used in different countries, different places, or different uses. So how do we make sure at this stage that we are not recreating issues elsewhere? So it's just an overlook of where could AI ethics tools be used and also where they are used currently. I will show you some examples of AI ethics tools, and I will try to also show you a typology that has been done, and I put a reference of a systematic review of available AI ethics tools, and I will invite you probably to read it. It's a very interesting article. So before we jump in and we see more in depth all the details and maybe all the strategies that could be used, I just want you to think for a quick second about what's a tool. It seems like a very simple question, but when we had this conversation with in a public health lab with senior researchers, professors, and we just asked the question, okay, what's the difference between a tool or an instrument, a framework or a method? And we realized that in most situations, in professional contexts, it is sometimes difficult to distinguish exactly if a tool that is something that will be used for a very specific task can always be differentiated from what we would call an instrument. An instrument seems like maybe more sophisticated or sounds more sophisticated. But then we also know that there are some tools or projects called tools that are actually methods or frameworks. And we'll see that as well in a few seconds or minutes. So this could really seem like a rhetorical question, but the term tool is quite vague and can encompass various strategies, shapes, and forms. So the question here is, should we really try to narrow down all the possibilities? And when we talk about AI ethics tools, should we just decide, okay, we only want tools, we don't want frameworks, we don't want instruments, we don't want methods? I think that would be a mistake because the fields of practices are very diverse and the needs are very diverse as well. So there is not one size does not fit all, for sure. And here the question is, when you hear tool, and when we'll talk about tools in the coming slides, bear in mind that the term tool can encompass or encapsulate all these different approaches. So maybe, Roberto, are there any questions? If there is anything that I can answer right now?
Yes, there's only one question from me, if you wish.
Mm-hmm.
Is in your definition of tool also including things like processes?
Exactly. Okay, so that's a very good question, because that's a question that I ask myself, and we also ask ourselves with researchers, is, okay, is a process more a method or an instrument, a tool? And for me, again, I think under the term tool, I will include a wide variety of methodologies or tools or processes or shapes and forms. And a process can definitely be considered a tool. So I think the term tool can be a little bit misleading because it could only mean, okay, it's something that we will use in a very practical context that will help us strictly apply or be more ethical. But sometimes the reality is a bit more complex, and I think, as you said, Roberto, a process can also be maybe a more adequate term for some of the tools that we see. And I will talk about, for instance, the EU assessment list, and I think this is something that we could call an AI ethics tools. But if we have to be more accurate in the description, we would call it a process. So that definitely for me includes process. So the question is there a need for AI ethics tools? It's a question that I personally like, so maybe not you, but the question is there really a need for that? Because what we often see in research and in many different fields is we maybe create and spend a lot of energy and efforts on projects, on ideas that are maybe not even needed in the real context. Another way to formulate this question is, do AI developers really need AI ethics tools? Do administrators or deciders need AI ethics tools? Well, there are many ways of answering this question. Maybe we don't need all the tools, maybe not all the tools are good, but overall, in general, we can establish that there is currently sort of a vacuum or something that needs to be done. Over 80 guidelines and ethical declarations were released in recent years. So I, for that, encourage you to read the review by Jobin and colleagues from Switzerland from 2019. They really went over all the existing guidelines at the time. And what it shows is, it's also something that Luciano Floridi from Oxford saw. They tend to converge around 5 key principles that you can find in bioethics: justice and fairness, non-maleficence, autonomy, responsibility, and privacy. It's great to have converging principles. It's great to have all these ethical guidelines from the public sector, the private sector, from NGOs, from universities. And I have nothing against ethical guidelines. I even work for people who created the Montreal Declaration for responsible use of artificial intelligence. So I think it was a necessary step at that time to establish what we consider moral and what we consider not moral. The issue is that very few of these guidelines provide tools, and declarations provide tools to translate them into practice. So what that means is it is sometimes hard to interpret or translate high-level principles into very applied fields. It can be an issue because having access to converging principles does not bring change in the design of algorithmic systems. In other terms, what it means is, if I read the declaration of Montreal, for instance, it might make me more knowledgeable, it might make me more aware and open to understanding what are the ethical challenges. However, the knowledge step is not enough. We need something else to make it actionable. Otherwise, we just remain with a very theoretical knowledge. And when we talk about making AI systems more responsible, it is not enough. So it was a necessary step in order to inform future or current legal systems about the issues that are key or the most important. It's also very useful to know, okay, what do we agree on? What do we disagree on? Another issue with these guidelines is they are not universal. There is not one, again, one size does not fit all here as well, because what we understand or mean by transparency in Europe might not be the same in North America, in China. So it is important to bear in mind that even if we have converging principles, they do not mean the same thing in different countries or in different fields of practices. So what we do need actually is to move one step further. And I really appreciated this article by Brent Mittelstadt from Oxford as well, who said in Nature Machine Intelligence that principles alone cannot guarantee ethical AI. So I will just read his words because I think he says it much better than I would. 4 characteristics of AI development suggest a principled approach may have limited impact on design and governance. Compared to medicine, AI development lacks first common aims and fiduciary duties, professional history and norms, proven methods to translate principles into practice, and robust legal and professional accountability mechanisms. In other terms, what Brent Mittelstadt means here is that definitely AI is a very young field, computer sciences as well. And so far, computer sciences as a field is not as equipped in terms of ethics, in terms of moral rules, as old fields like medicine or like just healthcare in general. In psychology, for instance, which is my, again, field of training, we have very strict rules on the way, if we are a psychologist, on the way you should work, what are the rules for you. We have a lot of texts helping us understanding exactly these same principles that we've been taught. And we also have very strict legal and professional accountability mechanisms, meaning that we know exactly if we don't do something well, what will happen next. If one specific person in a hospital does something bad, we know what will happen. We have sort of multiple scenarios of what to do in different contexts and situations. However, what we've seen recently and in the past years is that for computer sciences and AI specifically, it is not always possible to say who will be accountable. There is one example that we've seen in Canada called the Phoenix system. The Phoenix system was, for instance, the payroll management system of the federal government of Canada. And it used very basic algorithms and AI systems. But what happened is too much money was given away to the employees, and also a lot of money was not given to other employees. And it was really a big mess. And it was really hard, even 5 years after that, to establish who was accountable. So was it the developer? Was it the government? It was very difficult, and it still is very difficult. So what I mean by why do I use this example is to show you that there may be a need for more processes or more actionable principles that will tell you exactly in specific situation what will happen or what should happen. So he keeps going on by saying these weaknesses in existing legal and professional accountability mechanisms for AI raises a difficult question. Is it enough to define good intentions and hope for the best without complementary punitive mechanisms and governance bodies to step in when self-governance fails? A principled approach runs the risk of merely providing false assurances of ethical or trustworthy AI. Here, Brent Mittelstadt raises a very interesting point. If you read documents from the French government, the American government, also at the time from other private institutions who publish guidelines, some of them tend to say, well, these are the moral principles we think are important. However, we should wait a little bit before making them or translating them into legal systems, because we don't know what the competition or other competing countries will do. So we don't want to be negatively impacted because we have too strict rules for us, and while the others don't have strict rules. So what they mean by that is there is a gray area still right now, even if the European Union went forward and had this like great GDPR. In other legal systems, there is definitely a gray zone. We don't know exactly what to do, if a rule is only moral or is it legal. It is somewhat blurry. So AI ethics tools here could be helpful to sort of make the high-level principles way more applied, way more concrete, and also more detailed. So that is one avenue and one potential need that AI ethics tools could address. You had already, if you have been in the other classes, presentations that mentioned this, the fact that there is a very varying terminology around what we call responsible, accountable, or liable. And here the goal is, so what's the ultimate goal of an AI ethics tools? Is it to make or to encourage or promote a more responsible AI development? Is it to improve the design of ethical systems? Is it to have more accountable processes, more liable projects? It's probably all of the above because the tools can go in many different directions. However, it is sometimes difficult because if we don't define a clear goal, if we don't say and state specifically why we create a tool, what's its purpose, what's its goal, then there is a risk to aim too wide and to not be specific enough. Sometimes the word responsible can be used in a very blurry way, and it does not help understanding exactly what's the ultimate goal of the rules or the tool. So it's just, this slide is just a large question, and I refer to an article by Kaler called Responsibility, Accountability, and Governance. And he talks about the fact that this varying terminology does not mean that responsible and accountable mean the same thing. They do mean different things, and it's important when we talk about governance or when we talk about making some moral rules, translate them into practice. It is important to know exactly what we have in mind. So these tools could be a way to apply high-level principles. So this is one main avenue that we see right now. These tools could be helpful to apply high-level principles or serve as compliance strategies. So one good example of that is the EU's assessment list. This list was developed by the high-level expert group, and its aims are to help organizations develop trustworthy AI systems, but also to promote some best practices. And finally, in their own terms, to operationalize the EU's key requirements for ethical AI and offers guidance to implement them in practice. To be a little bit more specific, here is an example of one of the items of the EU's assessment list. So question 7, so they have, let's start maybe by that, 7 categories: human agency and oversight, technical robustness and safety, privacy and data governance, transparency, diversity, non-discrimination and fairness, societal and environmental well-being, and accountability. So as you see, and you already suspected probably, so this is really completely aligned with the white paper and the documents published by the high-level expert group. What they had in mind was really to try to help people understand better what they meant in their official report, and also to answer one question is, how do we translate them into practice? So they came up with this assessment list. The assessment list is mainly comprises of questions, and such as in the technical robustness and safety, in the subsection resilience to attack and security, did you assess potential form of attacks to which the AI system could be vulnerable? So as you see here, this is the first example of tools that could be designed. It is a checklist, more or less, an assessment list. The goal is to have an AI developer or decider go through the list and decide and check that he or she has thought about all the potential risks or challenges, has thought about all the main and most important topics. So the goal here is to really provide a large overview that could help someone understand better, okay, what could happen? What should I think about? How could I interpret the big documents that have been published by the European Union? What does that mean for my specific field of practice? So this is one way of applying these high-level declarations into practice is to translate them into questions, to translate them into checklists. So this was a very interesting approach because it was one of the almost only ones to have done that, to have provided a very concrete tool to do so. If we may criticize or at least be nuanced, the issue here is also it was not specified really what's the level of knowledge required to apply this assessment list. Who should be the person answering the questions? Also, who and when should we use it most specifically? So these are some questions that could be relevant to other examples that we'll see in a few minutes. And I will also share the fact that this assessment list is probably has been criticized, and we'll see that at the end of the presentation. Another example is AI ethics tools can come from very different places. We've seen that it could come from major institutions releasing guidelines, but it could also come from private companies who want to maybe have a more structured process, in-house process to be more accountable or more ethical or more responsible when developing AI. And what Intel has done is they have this webpage with a toolkit. This toolkit has different categories. For instance, you have digital data inventory, a guide to proposal development, engagement guidelines, data maturity framework. And what you see is Intel is trying to provide developers various tools to be more quote unquote responsible. So you can see under data maturity framework below a readiness assessment tool for nonprofit data projects. So as you can see, the assessment list or assessment tool is definitely one avenue that people are embracing, that researchers or developers are embracing. There is one thing that I could add also. For me personally, what I understand by, and when I say developer, it includes engineers, but not only. I really use the European Union's terminology, and AI developers are people who are involved in the design, in the development of an AI system from the design stage to the deployment, and they can be engineers, they can be officials, they can be just entrepreneurs. So this can encompass a wide variety of actors in that. Another type of AI ethics tools that could show something a bit more creative than an assessment list is this MIT project called AI Blind Spot. AI Blind Spot tried to include a more playful, based on design way of helping developers understanding what could be the ethical challenges or risks, and that I'm not seeing. So that's why the term blind spot here is a very good term. I find it's really, we mentioned that some risk can be because people are using AI in a quote unquote evil way, but most of the time, and probably in 90% of the time, it's because we don't or we didn't make the effort or thought about looking thoroughly through what could happen, what are the potential risks, what are the potential challenges, or the unintended consequences of my project. So they even also provided a figure showing where could the problems arise. So they developed around 8-9 key cards or questions for 3 different stages. For them, the first stage is planning, then the second stage is building, and then the third stage is deploying. So this, what they call the discovery process, for them is just a way of saying you can use these cards if you are at the design stage or the planning stage, but you can also use them if you have already developed your system and you're more thinking about, okay, what can happen once I've deployed it? And so these questions are very playful, and these cards are very playful and are sort of encouraging people to ask themselves questions. So it could work in a group setting, it could work as a focus group tool to ask various questions. They are sometimes very technical, and they come from MIT, so they had that in mind, that people who might want to use it can come from a very technical field. And what I like about this approach is, I don't know, they didn't show anything about the efficiency or what happens when before and after you use this tool. But what I like is they really try to be a little bit more pedagogic, or a little bit more understanding that just reading high-level principles is maybe not the best way to know exactly how to do in specific contexts or in reality. And also, it is important to integrate at your own level, what do these high-level principles mean? How do I understand them? So this tool is maybe more targeting a very applied way of showing you what does it mean to be responsible? What does it mean to be transparent? And they go into details to sort of show for each stage or each problem what you can do, how you could do it. So these three examples show that there is a momentum. There is momentum. Here's an example that, and I want to thank my colleague Vincent May for sharing that with me. But the Neural Information Processing Systems, or NeurIPS, one of the main conferences for machine learning and the deep learning field, has published conference guidelines very recently, this year, in the past month. And for the first time, what do they say? They say that the authors should have the authors adequately address the broader impact of their work, including potential negative ethical and societal implications of their work. And question 12 is, does the submission raise potential ethical concerns? This includes methods, application, or data that create or reinforce unfair bias, or that have a primary purpose of harm or injury. Here, you can see that this is a major change, and it's definitely a shift of paradigm, because now we ask people coming from a very technical field to think about ethics. The key question here is, most of the technical trainings or universities or programs do not always include a class about ethics. So this is something that we try to do at the Algora Lab at the University of Montreal and the MILA, Quebec Artificial Intelligence Institute, is to also sensitize and try to educate people about the potential ethical concerns when developing AI systems. And here, what I'm pretty sure that these new guidelines will probably change a lot of things, including in our own research center, where most of the people work on sometimes on very theoretical projects. And when you work on a theoretical project about an ultra specialized way of applying or conceptualizing neural networks, probably ethical considerations seem like a very distant concern. It's not the number one thing you want to work on. However, what we see is like that NeurIPS is now requiring that. And they provide, and I put it in bold, a small phrase that for me will probably have practical implications. They say authors should take care to discuss both positive and negative outcomes. So it means that there should be a conversation about all the projects using machine learning or deep learning for NeurIPS. But what does it mean into practice? It means that maybe people do need tools or need support to be able to have this conversation about the positive and negative outcomes. And I think that AI ethics tools could definitely help for this stage, because if you don't come from the field of ethics, you don't maybe, and if you come from computer sciences or machine learning, you don't have time always to catch up with all about ethics. That's what you guys are doing with this series of classes about AI ethics, but not everybody does it. Maybe not everybody is interested in it. And so AI ethics tools here could be very helpful to help people who are maybe not trained or maybe less interested in spending a lot of time to at least get a shorter, a more summarized version of the main key topics to have in mind when they want to discuss about the negative outcomes or positive outcomes. So here you can see that maybe the assessment list that we've seen, where you ask yourself questions, maybe this could be an interesting avenue for to help engineers or computer scientists to answer the questions about the positive or negative outcomes. If as a group or a research team, you just sit down or now have a Zoom meeting and talk about, you want to think about the negative outcomes, maybe asking yourself a series of questions could be one way of looking at it. There is one thing though, is asking yourself a series of questions can also be quite unsettling, because if you ask yourself big questions and you realize, well, oh, my project could be extremely harmful, or there could be a potential misuse, and if you project yourself very far away, then you can realize that there can be something very bad. And sometimes asking yourself a question does not tell you exactly, well, what should I do then? Should I stop? And it can be a little bit, puzzling, and also it can be quite confronting, because you confront your project to maybe very hard questions. So the problem is, as we've seen, that there are many different tools coming from different fields, and there was not a typology, meaning just a categorization of the ethics tools. And that's where Jessica Morley has been very helpful. She's a researcher from Oxford and the NHS. She has been in charge, among other things, of establishing all the guidelines and tools for ethics, data ethics, and AI ethics, made available for free in open access by the British government. And they have created a lot of tools, and so she has been involved in that. And she worked with Luciano Floridi again to conduct a systematic review of the available AI ethics tools. They used also arXiv, which is an interesting strategy, because a lot of the tools were not available in peer-reviewed databases, such as IEEE Explorer for the computer sciences, or other databases we could cite, for instance, PubMed, etc. Why is that? It's because people have these projects, have these ideas, and they just put it on arXiv, maybe thinking, all right, I want to make it available, but I'm not sure that I will use it or explore it, but at least I formalized it and I want to make it available. So by including arXiv in their systematic review, they really captured a lot of the initiatives that people are trying to lead right now. And most of the initiatives on arXiv are, of course, very technical and come from computer sciences. So they created a typology, and their goal was to help practically minded developers apply ethics at each stage of the machine learning development pipeline, and to signal to researchers where further work is needed. So they did two things. The first thing is they used their typology, and they put all the tools that could help you for each stage or for each principle in the little boxes. So their typology can be helpful in two different ways. So the first one is, when you read the article, it will give you the tools that could maybe help you at the design phase to work on beneficence or non-maleficence or autonomy. But it also helps you as a developer to maybe ask yourself a series of questions or to try to answer and go through all the topics. So what they did is they also, as you can see, used the converging principles and beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, justice, and they also have this more European way of seeing a converging principle being explicability. So they say these are the 5 key principles that you should have in mind and that you should respect when you develop an AI system. And on the left, you can see that these are the main stages that they identified as the key moments where you could ask yourself questions, or you should work on these 5 main values or principles. So it's, I think, a preliminary work, and I'm eager and curious to see where that could lead. But what I find interesting with their approach is they really try to, again, formalize what are the expectations. So what are the main principles and what are the main stages? It sort of helps to know, okay, so it narrows down the amount of possibilities of things to work on. So if you have time, I suggest that you also read this article. It's fairly short and it's very enlightening, and they did a great job at explaining what convergent principles are, and also at explaining what the AI ethics tools could be or what they have found. So maybe, Roberto, are there any questions or are there any concerns or comments? And I'd be happy to answer them.
Yeah, thank you, Carl. Yes, there are a number of those. I can read from the chat backwards. So
Okay.
there's one, actually it's from me. When you were talking about checklists, and there are now a number of those, that reminds me a lot of what the European Commission does. When you submit the project proposal of any kind, you are supposed to have section verifying the ethical issues, if any, and sustainability of the project. This is on paper. So reviewers will, accept or not a project by looking at this section and maybe found it. The interesting thing is that I noticed that what here is in the topology, monitoring is missing. So nobody's looking at what happened afterwards. So the question is, checklists are quite good, but how do they work when the AI is used?
That's a good question. And what we can see is the EU's assessment list, again, I think doesn't really tell you when to use it, at which stage. So I find that is something missing, and definitely the monitoring aspect is key. And when we're talking about deployment, I think we're also talking then after that about, in a technical term, about maintenance, about making sure that there is a stability of the process over time and that it remains ethical over time. And it's a key question. And so, for instance, for the checklist that I developed starting in 2018, I had to take that into consideration, and I used the expertise of a computer engineer with also the expertise of people from healthcare, and we tried to think about the different stages, and we included that. But it's definitely the key thing about checklists. If I look at how they are used, for instance, in healthcare, we love checklists. We have way too many checklists, but it is a very common tool that we like and appreciate because it helps us understanding what to do in a very specific context. So most of the checklists are sometimes published with a very specific timeline in mind. So they specify most of the time when you should use it or for what purpose. So I think, yeah, creating and designing a checklist should also come with a manual or with the clear guidelines on when, where, and for whom you're designing the checklist.
Yeah, thank you, Carl. There is a related question to that from
Yes.
Joanna that says, who validates what is ethical, what is biased, and so on? in each company. I'm sure she's referring to some of the ethical guidelines proposed by a number of tech companies recently. And you could also, and I think it's also interesting because if I might add, if you consider the current situation in the United States where Facebook decision of not deciding to interfere on content on their own pages, the question is always who is in charge of deciding what is ethical?
Absolutely. And for me, thank you, Joanna and Roberto, for the question. It really refers to that. So this phrase by Mittelstadt that said that without complementary punitive mechanism and governance bodies to step in when self-governance fails, a principled approach runs the risk of merely providing false assurances of ethical or trustworthy AI. So my point is, indeed, validation of these tools is sometimes a very blurry aspect of the whole field of AI ethics tools. When private companies or private institutions published guidelines about AI ethics, sometimes it could look like a way of having a good public image, and maybe the validity of the tool or the actual applicability of the tool was secondary. And maybe the first key element here in this initiative was to show that we are actively working on AI ethics, or at least in appearance. And as you mentioned with Facebook, Facebook said, after having said at the beginning that let's move fast and break things, now they said we'll be so transparent, we'll be the most transparent company in the world. And how does that work? Does your example show that they're being extremely transparent about how they select information, how they do it? No. So for me, you raised, Joanna, a very important question is, how do we make sure that the tools used and published are serious? What are the people involved in it? I think there should be a lot of transparency in the AI system, but as well in the people developing guidelines and all the tools. When we publish a paper, we have to state the conflicts of interest, we have to state who is funding us, and so forth. So sometimes it's pretty obvious when we take something from a source where it comes from, but I think it's still important to have, or at least that's my opinion, to translate the obligations that we have, for instance, as researchers, but also, or as computer scientists, and then translate them also in other fields that are maybe less equipped in ethics boards, less equipped in AI ethics training, but there should be rigor in all the different fields. But however, I think it's just a bit wishful thinking so far.
Yeah.
But
thank you, Carl. Do you have time for a couple more questions?
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's one from Patrizio Migliarini at the beginning of your presentation. So
okay,
actually 30 minutes after you finish the first part. The question is the following. Considering Floridi's soft and hard ethics concepts, hard ethics will be coded by law, so it will be, if not easy at least, possible to recognize the context where to apply the rule by law description. Now the question, how to apply soft ethics instead? How to recognize soft ethics context question to enforce machine to manage ethics applications?
That's a very interesting question, because indeed, when we say just the word ethics, and when we say we're doing an AI ethics tool, ethics is a very wide field. We have, of course, deontology, or deontological principles that are very specific fields that are more strict rules. Then we have also maybe more philosophical questions, or we can question in the more meta-ethics field the implication of concepts, of large concepts as good, bad, and so forth. And so when we're thinking about, okay, what could an AI ethics tool be, and what does it mean in practice? What are the possible implications, and how far can we go into coding or making an AI system ethical? There are definitely some, for me at least, some challenges. The first one is that the principle or the stuff need to be very clearly defined. And so Floridi has his own framework or system that is understandable in the European Union's approach, because there is also the GDPR behind that can sort of be that goes along his views. So they are sort of going hand in hand. But when I try to apply Floridi's views in the North American system, then it is very difficult for me sometimes to know exactly how the concept of explicability, for instance, can be translated into the legal system of Canada or into the legal system of America. It is sometimes very difficult. Just to give you an example of the situation in Canada, each province in Canada has its own privacy commissioner. We have also one privacy commissioner for the province of Canada. But so when we create rules or when we have tools, maybe that could work for one specific province, but maybe not work exactly for the other provinces. And so there is a big dependency on the context where these tools are being developed. There are assumptions and there are also preconceived notions of what can be applicable. And so I don't know if I'm answering really the question, but that raised a series of random thoughts about it. The question is, yeah, how can we code them? For me, sometimes the main question before that is, yeah, how can we agree on a common understanding of the concept that is being used? Is this concept applicable in different fields, in different countries? And it is not always possible to answer affirmatively for that.
Thank you, Carl. We'll let you continue.
Okay. So the Canada Protocol. I'll give you a quick overview of what I created. And so it's not because I'm in a form of pure delusion and ego trip, but it's just to show you my experience, but also to show you the lessons learned and also some of the challenges ahead. So how did I come to the idea of making a checklist? So as I said, I come from psychology and I was working on the responsible use of AI and quote unquote big data in psychology and in prevention specifically. I worked for the French government now 8 years ago as a researcher, and we had to develop systems or think about systems to detect as early as possible pathological gamblers. And that showed me 7-8 years ago that there were key questions that we need to address before doing all of that. Questions related to privacy, questions related to ethics, questions related to also the ethics of psychology and professional practice. Can we detect or help someone who was not aware that we were trying to detect him or her? And are we allowed to help this person? What are the scenarios in which we should consider intervening or writing a message directly? So these were really, it was a little bit like the Wild Wild West. We didn't have, at the time, many strict rules. It was way before GDPR. And that raised the question, all right, we maybe need to have a framework or guidelines to know what to do in these situations. Because as a researcher, I was kind of puzzled by the amount of questions that we were facing and by how little tools we had or how little guidance or support we had to answer these questions. And as we can see that now 10 years after almost, some of these questions are maybe still not answered, but at least my goal was to start working and be a little bit more specialized in the field of the ethics of using these tools or technologies applied to prevention. So I'm not a computer scientist, again, and I come from a field where I was a researcher applying or working with computer scientists applying these technologies for my specific field. So my goal was, okay, how could we create a bridge between psychology or prevention or healthcare with computer sciences and with ethics? How can we create a common vocabulary? How can we create a common understanding of the main ethic rules so that we all work together with at the same pace, with the same understanding of the key questions? So as you may have known, AI and big data is increasingly used to monitor suicide risk and analyze large volumes of electronic health records to flag maybe who could be at risk. And I work specifically for this tool on suicide prevention because suicide prevention is an interesting situation. It's a situation where sometimes all the legal rules or all rules are sort of off, meaning that in order to save a human life, a lot of governments, or even as humans, we sometimes will do anything to save a life. So I'm not here to say if it's good or not. Obviously, I wouldn't work in suicide prevention if I didn't think that it's important to save lives. However, there should be rules, as for many other fields or professions, on what we are allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do. And definitely AI and big data were asking new questions that we had never faced before and that we were not equipped to deal or to answer to. So my initiative was really, again, creating a bridge between three distinct fields. And my goal was to create a tool that could help either people from mental health who want to use AI for prevention projects or for mental health reasons or suicide prevention reasons, to understand what could be the main key challenges and risks related to AI when applied to their field. Then I also wanted that people from the field of ethics who are for the first time dealing with a project involving AI on mental health, and people who were maybe not trained on the specific ethical challenges of AI or machine learning or deep learning, while they could also have access to the same principles and understand, again, what are maybe some of the perspectives from people from mental health with their very specific challenges, or the specific perspectives and challenges from people from computer sciences. So I try to create, as we say in French, a sheep with 5 legs, meaning an impossible beast that maybe doesn't exist. So it's either a very ugly creature or a very successful weird animal, but that could sort of help. What I mean by that is we tried to create at the time something that didn't really exist. There were checklists like the Delicate checklist by German researchers in computer sciences. It was focused on data ethics, but there were not that many tools on making AI ethics applicable for a specific field, and in my case, mental health. So what's in the kind of protocol? It's a checklist. So why did I use a checklist? It's because after trying to figure out what could be the best tool that could be the most usable by health professionals or computer scientists working hand in hand with health professionals, I came to the conclusion that a checklist is probably the most common tool that we use in healthcare, and is probably also the most approachable tool, because it can be used in a short amount of time, or in a relatively short amount of time. It is a summarized, narrowed down version of maybe more complex legal documents or technical documents or the literature. It sort of summarizes in key points what you need to think about. It doesn't mean that it's completely exhaustive and that it covers all the topics, but at least there was an effort made to help you go through what should I think about before doing so-and-so. You have checklists for surgeries, you have checklists for researchers. If you are a researcher or if you have ever done a systematic review. There are many checklists, including one, the Prisma checklist, that sort of tells you what you think about. Checklists can be very useful for another reason, is if we all use the same tool, then we sort of all have a common understanding or a common ground on what should be done or what could be done. And it's fairly simple, and it's maybe not, again, exhaustive, and it probably needs refinement all the time to be adjusted and to evolve, but it was at least what we proposed. It is comprised of 38 items. So what we did is we analyzed 14 documents. We had way more documents, but we retained 14 main documents to explore what could be the ethical challenges. We went through all these documents, ethical declarations, key documents, and declarations on ethics and technologies. And what we did is every time we found a mention of an ethical issue or an ethical challenge or an ethical mention, we extracted it. And what we did, and our goal was to say, all right, we'll take documents from different fields, from the 3 different fields that we had in mind, ethics, computer sciences, and healthcare, and we'll try to see what are the main challenges about AI or related to AI that we can find in this literature. We found over 450 mentions of potential ethical issues and challenges, and we had to remove the duplicates, so we had to narrow that down. We did several categorization stages. Several people were involved in it, people from computer sciences, from ethics, and from healthcare. After several stages of work with 2 researchers, we ended up with a list of 45 items that was then submitted to a panel of 16 international experts. So it can seem very boring, but it is possible. But here the question was, how can we validate the content and make sure that it's relevant for the people who are targeted, the target users? So a Delphi methodology is a methodology widely used in healthcare and in humanities because it allows to propose a content or a list or a tool or whatever you have in mind to a group of targeted experts. And what you want from them is a very qualitative feedback on the document that you submit to them. It has several rounds, meaning that they were allowed to comment this list of 45 items that we submitted to them, to modify it, to exclude items. The goal was here to have the most concise checklist, to have the most relevant items as possible. So they reformulated everything. They worked on rearranging the different categories, and then we did that for 2 rounds until there was an overall consensus on the form and on the content. So I think I will save your morning and your patience by maybe not reading all the items, but it will show you our approach and how we decided to move on and work on it. So as I said, the goal was to raise important questions on the main key topics that were identified in the literature. Meaning, if you are a developer and you want to use AI for the field of mental health or for the field of suicide prevention, what are the potential challenges that might arise? And so this tool was already used by the Public Health Agency of Canada for one of their strategies, prevention strategies. They wanted to use and monitor suicide risk on social media and on Twitter more specifically. And the question that they had is, what's the risk? What are the risks for the Canadian population? And so they contacted us and used this tool in order to sort of organize and structure their ethical analysis process. So the first category is what we call description, meaning maybe it's important to ask developers if they made available or know where to find the information or could make this information available on different things that are related to the basic description of their AI system. For instance, are they able to describe the objectives? Are they able to describe the technology used? to name and be as accurate as possible in their description. Are there funding or conflict of interest? Are there, if they say we are doing an expert system or we are doing a cutting edge AI system to detect suicide risk, for instance, using publicly available data or electronic health records. So a lot of private companies are trying to do that as well. They say we have a lot of experts on board. So the question here is, all right, if you have experts on board, can you state exactly who they are, what are their expertise, and so forth. Then the target population. Sometimes some projects in mental health, and as we can see, and I worked recently on the health apps that you can find on the Android App Store. I swear that most of these apps have very broad objectives, very broad topics, and so sometimes what we can see, mostly coming from the private sector, applied to healthcare or mental health, is we can see projects that are maybe not very focused on a specific target population. They're just about broad considerations like wellness in general. But when applied to people in need or in a state of crisis or maybe unwell, it is important to be a little bit more specific. So as you can see, it is the question, the items are phrased sort of as semi-questions, meaning that we wanted people to try to do actionable procedures. Like, if I take responsibility, I said, describe who will be legally accountable for your autonomous intelligent system actions and decisions. There were several versions. One was only a question, can you describe? But we decided after several feedbacks that it should be maybe more precise and affirmative. So all of these items are based on recommendations from the literature. So we had privacy and transparency, we had security, we had health-related risks for people who are not trained in bioethics or in the ethics of working in healthcare. These are the main key topics that you should have in mind. And then we also had a section about biases. May they be scientific, or might they be just related to the type of data that you use for your system. So as you can see, there are, this checklist tried to summarize again what could be the key topics that you should have in mind. So ideally, in an ideal world, someone who has a project or a team who has a project involving AI for mental health or for suicide prevention could or should go through the checklist and try to answer all the questions. So this checklist sort of assesses the availability of the information. We didn't want to put a score for many reasons that I will explain in 1 or 2 slides, because we felt like the goal here is to help people be more aware and to improve the knowledge. What we discovered in psychology or healthcare is that people have no idea whatsoever at the time, most of the people, of what are the ethical challenges associated with AI. So the goal was to really try to make them more approachable and understandable. And we try to do that as well for the health-related risks. So there are some challenges when developing AI ethics tools, and our experience led us to discover a few lessons and also to have a few major ethical considerations. We thought about the fact that maybe what we're doing could be misused, but also could have potential risks. So, as my accent probably showed you, I am French, and in France we love aesthetics. And the first question was the Tower of Babel. So, meaning that when we create a tool, we have to be aware, and I mentioned that earlier, that it might be used by professionals from different fields and professionals who do not always use the same terminology. And when they do, what we discovered is there might be some misunderstanding. For instance, if you say to someone who comes from computer sciences the word detection, it might mean something quite different than for someone who comes from prevention. When we say detection, it maybe has more moral implications or ethical implications, whereas just detection can be just a technical term. For someone coming from computer sciences, it can be something serious for sure, but it can also be just a process or a part of the system. And what we saw is if you use the word detection, someone coming from mental health might already be very sensitive about all the ethical implications of what does a detection process entail. What we discovered also is since not everybody received the training in ethics, sometimes trying to create a tool for 3 different target users was maybe a challenge because the levels of knowledge about ethics or deontological rules was not the same. And there was maybe sometimes we identified gaps that maybe need to be filled in the future, especially in computer sciences where if we have a conversation between people who have received an ethical training every year for 5 to 10 years in healthcare versus one class in a computer engineering school, as I have seen very recently in the past month in Quebec, then there might be a little knowledge gap that we need to bridge. Also, we realized that when you put computer scientists, health professionals, or ethicists together, there are preconceived notions about the other. So when some items were flagged by ethicists as maybe too simple or maybe too vulgarized, and then we had health professionals thinking, well, these items are maybe very obvious, but they were not for the others. And so we had to find and create a tool that sort of could make everybody happy. But some people also say that a good negotiation or a good compromise is when everybody feels slightly unhappy and slightly happy at the same time. So that's a question. Then there is a key question. Whatever ethics tool that you're using, there is for me a major question. I would phrase it as an ethical baseline. Does it exist an ethical baseline? We didn't want to provide a score for us because after consulting a few professors in ethics and experts in ethics, they said, well, you should not do a score because there is no such thing as an ethical baseline, meaning there is no consensus on what we consider universally moral or even what could be the most moral thing to do. There is a wide variability and there are many things to consider when we talk about ethical requirements, but an ethical baseline is a concept that sort of makes ethicists probably uneasy and they tend to be against it. However, what I've seen is, for instance, I worked on a tool developed by the In Theory team at the University of Montreal, and they created a tool for the responsible research and innovation. And they decided to provide a score saying, well, this score could just simply assess the availability of some key information that we want to evaluate. And it is not assessing the availability of information is not exactly an ethical baseline. However, if you have a checklist with the ethical recommendations or ethical rules or ethical translations of high-level principles, maybe some people expect to know after having done the checklist or gone through the checklist, am I doing something wrong here? Am I doing something ethical or not? And all the ethical guidelines and declarations give an indication of what could be an ethical baseline, but what does it really mean? Is it just a minimal level of ethical requirements? Is it a universal set of moral rules that everyone should follow? This question is still very, very blurry. So the more specialized we are and the more precise we are for the field, if we are strictly following ethical or deontological rules, then yes, we could be able to say, have you respected the minimal requirements from your profession or your field of practice? But ethical and legal are not always completely combined. They don't overlap always. So the question is, if I say that this is the minimum level of ethical requirements that I'm expecting, it does not mean that it's also the minimal legal requirement. And we see that with the GDPR. The GDPR gives a very precise level of the minimum level of legal requirements that you should do. So in terms of compliance, the GDPR is probably the most complete compliance set of rules. But ethics, again, can, as we've seen in the first slides, can help you explore future questions that are maybe not currently in the legal systems. So I tried to look at what was done in computer sciences, and I found that Dean and colleagues created in their research data mining an ethical baseline for online privacy policies. They tried to create a tool that could give you a sense of what are the key or minimal ethical requirements when we talk about online privacy policies. So, as I said just previously, the more specialized a tool will be, maybe the more it will be able to provide a score or an ethical or a score to tell you where you're at. Are you in the red zone? Are you in the green zone? Are you in the orange zone? Another challenge that you might find if you try to develop an analytics tools, or if you use one that you should be aware of, is that there are a few misuses and challenges ahead of us. These tools and declarations are not exempt of criticism, including a potential contribution to ethical whitewashing. One of the experts of the high-level expert group of the European Union that contributed to the documents that I presented, or that I mentioned, had very mixed feelings, to say the least, about the output of the high-level expert group. So here is a quote, and I gave you two links if you're ever curious. According to philosopher Thomas Metzinger at Johannes Gutenberg University Mainz in Germany, big tech indulges in what he says is ethics washing and wields too much influence on proposed industry regulation around AI. According to Metzinger, big tech companies' ethical debates on AI are red herrings to delay policy formation and regulation worldwide. So for him, ethical guidelines, if they are not completely sometimes legal, or from my understanding of what he says, could just be, again, wishful thinking, and could be used as a way to sort of show that, or in appearance that you are being ethical, while not being very ethical in practice. And it can be a way of being deceptive, and tools could be used to sort of try to show that you are ethical. And we can think about a parallel example. If you think about what has been done in terms of respecting, for instance, the environment and all the rules or ethical guidelines published by major companies about respecting the environment, we all know and we all have seen advertisements or guidelines or documents from polluting companies saying that they're being very green and ethical and respecting the environment. I think it can go the same here. Showing that you have worked or that you have a set of guidelines does not mean necessarily that you are actually doing it. So my point is not to say that we should not do it, but we should be cautious, and we should also, I'm aware that my tool could be used for what we could call a post hoc justification, meaning you do everything, and then you use this tool to sort of show, all right, we've gone through that, even if you haven't really been doing a thorough analysis. There is also an English expression that I really like. It's called window dressing. So the Cambridge Dictionary says that window dressing is things that are not of real importance and are said or done in order to make an attractive effect. Example, how many of the candidates' policies are real intentions and how many are just window dressing. So it's closely related to ethical washing, but it's maybe more minimal. It just means that people say, we follow these guidelines. I work currently on the ethical challenges of using AI in dentistry. And I've seen in a lot of papers that people refer to the Helsinki Declaration, and someone who is a researcher in the industry told me, well, we use the reference to the Helsinki Declaration just to show that we are being ethical, but because we don't really have an ethics board, or we didn't really want to go through the ethics board because we know that it doesn't really apply and it's a tedious process. So we just refer to the Helsinki Declaration without even explaining what rules or principles of the Helsinki Declaration we use, because that's maybe the easiest way for us to say that we're being ethical and to look serious, to look rigorous. So as you can see, this is an example of window dressing, meaning I'm just using or quoting an ethical declaration or an ethics tools without having really used it. Then we have another issue here. It's called, it's the idea of inclusion and participation. A lot of the tools often do not talk or mention were the targeted populations or the targeted users involved in the process of the design of the ethical guidelines or the ethics tools. That raises an important question. How can we make sure that these tools are adapted to the targeted field or the people impacted by AI systems, or are even needed? So as many people say, it is important to maybe go above inclusion and promote active participation. How do we do that? There are more and more ethical deliberations being led in the world by NGOs, by public organizations. So deliberations are tools. It's a methodology that has been used for ages, and more in the political sciences, in order to capture the perspectives of citizens on specific topics. How do they feel about it? What are their suggestions? How do they want this future policy to be applied to them? And deliberations are a very useful tool to maybe understand better what could be done. So this is something that we're trying to do. It is a challenge because even now more because of the pandemic, leading deliberation was sort of fairly straightforward and easy to do face-to-face, but now we have to do it online, and we have two projects. We're, for instance, working with UNESCO to do ethical deliberations across the world to improve their future list of AI ethics standards. They have a list of AI ethics standards that they want to publish on their specific fields of interest, meaning education, culture, and so forth. And they really want to make sure that this list of standards that they will publish is acceptable or could be a good set of rules for different contexts and different countries. And so we are helping them with this process of deliberations. Then I'm also working with the ethics boards and the research funds of Quebec in Canada. The goal is we realize that ethics boards are rarely trained in AI ethics. And so we're trying to consult them in order to know what type of tool do you really want or need in order to be able to assess the potential ethical risks related to your project using AI or machine learning or whatever. What we realize is a lot of people, a lot of projects are being currently submitted, even more because of the pandemic. Because of the pandemic, a lot of AI projects were submitted in order to tackle some of the challenges that arose because of COVID-19. And a lot of projects use AI, but most of the ethics boards, at least in Quebec, in a lot of universities, do not have experts available to understand what are the potential risks, and a lot of ethics board members were sort of afraid of missing something. So that's what we're doing. We're trying to, first of all, consult them, and then we'll do deliberations, organized deliberations in order to create the tools that are the most adapted to them with the researchers using AI, with the ethics boards members, and with experts in data sciences and in AI. So in conclusion, AI ethics declarations and tools could contribute to more responsible development of AI, but it is still at a theoretical level. The Z-score and other initiatives show that there is now a trend of tools that are trying to be as applied as possible, as thorough and as precise as possible. And what we need now in the future, and we talked about it with Roberto, is to have more use cases to demonstrate their validity, usefulness. We need also to understand how they can be applied. So we're still at a theoretical level. There are a lot of ethics tools that have been developed. Most of them, as you can see in Jessica Molly's review, if you're curious, are still very preliminary. Even if some tools are used on a case-by-case basis, like for instance, my tool was developed in Canada and was used by some Canadian institutions, it is not, we're not there yet with the concept of a universal tool that could be applied everywhere. There are tools like the very well-known ethics by design and privacy by design framework of Anne Cavoucan from the who was the former privacy commissioner of Canada. And privacy by design, she has really popularized this concept, and she has created tools, trainings, and a framework that can be applied almost everywhere. And she's now working on creating a tool that could be used for AI ethics specifically. So there are very promising things coming ahead. And my point is, without strict regulation, however, and enforcing legal rules, all these ethics tools and guidelines could remain a form of wishful thinking. And that's something, it's a challenge that we've seen with the ethical guidelines, is as exhaustive as they can be, as smart as they can be, they sometimes tend to be lacking a legal backbone that could sort of help them become more than just principles or high-level principles. And ethics tools maybe in the future will maybe be closely related to the maybe legally enforced guidelines, and will be part of a whole set of rules. And I think the GDPR has shown it. There are a lot of businesses that have emerged in order to help private or small companies interpret or adapt big or high-level rules or principles to their specific business. So ethics tools, ethical processes, ethical frameworks have definitely a future. Maybe in a consulting perspective, but they definitely do have a future. So that was it for today. Thank you so much for your attention. The structure was a bit loose, but my goal was really to show you and highlight the lessons learned. There are many tools, and you had a few tools and one specific tool presented by Roberto, but my goal was to present also some of the lessons learned and to have a critical approach on what I'm trying to do as a researcher, and to maybe present to you some of the questions that we are facing currently, and to be sort of transparent about that. And I hope that was interesting for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carl. If you have time, there are no questions. So that would be nice if you can maybe spend some time on answering that. Thank you for the very interesting presentation. There is a question from Emily. Thanks for this interesting presentation. It was nice to hear. Has there been any thoughts about linking between the universal ethics baseline that you were talking about and the international human rights system? How would you view this?
That's an interesting question. Could Emily tell me more about the universal human rights that she's talking about?
We could ask Emily to either send some more comments, or if Emily wants to unmute and comment, she can also do that.
Okay, in the meantime, if Emily is still here, but the interesting thing for me in her question is also, yes, a universal baseline can be challenging for, I can unmute. Okay.
I think Emily is unmuting, so she might ask the question directly.
Okay, perfect.
Hi everyone, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, perfectly. Yes. Hello.
Okay, thanks again. I thought it was super interesting. It was just when you spoke about the baseline and the ethical baseline, which I could see certainly posing a challenge. It struck me that within the Universal Human Rights Declaration and International Human Rights Law, there are, of course, some principles that maybe could be drawn around the dignity, the equality. A lot of these, of course, are also reflected in law. But I was just wondering if you knew if anybody had already tried to look at that and ask that question and research, could we, should we, is that a possibility? So it was more looking at that. Okay. That framework as inspiration for these potential universal ethical baselines. But I wasn't sure it was a question.
Yeah, but no, that's very interesting, because I don't know if Vincent, my colleague, is around, but when we're working with UNESCO, we're definitely facing your question. We're definitely facing the question of how can we approach universal considerations when we're talking about AI ethics, and how can we think about the way it could be enforced or it could be respected. And the experience of human rights, for me at least, I'm just giving you my opinion, but has definitely shown that there are so many challenges, because countries will interpret differently universal rules or universal declarations, and sometimes won't even respect them, because the punishments or the enforcing mechanisms are not always present, or are not always dissuasive. I'm personally not in favor of a very dictatorial system where I'm not in favor of major punishments. That's not my point, but definitely when we were talking and trying to figure out how can we do ethical deliberations across the world, following the UNESCO's framework of rules, or the UNESCO's general approach, we realized that we were not able to talk about all the topics across all the regions of the world. There were some hot topics in some regions of the world, and there were some topics that were that you could not even mention in others. Then for deliberations, for instance, we use scenarios. We explain a scenario of a potential misuse or a potential ethical challenge or an ethical dilemma, and involving AI. And we ask people to talk about it, mention what they think is important in the situation and what could be done. And we ask people we want to ask people to think about what could be general rules that should be applied. What are their recommendations? And it is interesting to see that, yes, first, a universal ethical baseline is probably a myth. Is it something that we should aim for? I'm not sure, because definitely we do have different visions across the world of even democratic processes, or even what transparency means, privacy. And the second thing we've learned is also we've seen that these institutions like UNESCO or have definitely a very broad scope and aim that is probably at the other end of what we should do or maybe are trying to do with the AI ethics tools, because the need seems to be less how do I understand these international rules than how do you apply them for my specific field. I'm not an expert in international human rights or international ethical governance. What I want to know is if I'm working in, for instance, transportation or logistics, how do I make these rules okay for my field? So yeah, the ethical baseline is definitely, and the universal ethical baseline is definitely an issue. And again, if you're curious about that, I really enjoyed reading Brent Mittelstadt article about how converging principles are not enough, and he's really making a claim for an argument for more applied principles. So we still need the international rules to sort of say what we agree minimally on. But yes, in reality, I find that there might be a lot of different situations.
Thank you, Carl. We have a last question, so if you have time.
Yes.
Actually, it's from me. When you were describing your checklist, your Canada protocol, there was one item that was on evidence. I assume it's medical evidence, and there was some information there. The experience that we've been working on something similar, is that evidence is not obvious. At least, what we discovered that we were having other areas, so in cardiology, and we had a debate, and it seems to be in the medical space, there's a debate, who is supposed to give medical evidence? Is the domain specialist, like cardiologist, or public health? And apparently this is not solved. So how did you encounter a similar situation? How did you verify if somebody has no evidence and it was still maybe selling an AI product?
It's so the first way to answer your question is we've seen a lot of rebranding. When I started working on my project, it was the time of big data, and then it became the time of AI. And what we saw is people and big companies like IBM selling products for claiming that these are very efficient tools for big data, and then a year later, it was the same tool, but rebranded for AI. So what we saw is, for computer sciences specifically, there is, we saw that, yes, there is a form of rebranding where something that was deemed efficient for one specific type of technology, all of a sudden became deemed efficient or very useful for another one. So it is hard to assess the efficacy or the validity of the tools that are being sold right now. I feel like the technological products, it's quite difficult, and the level of expertise required is very high. Then the other thing specifically for healthcare is, I think a major concern for a lot of health professionals, including myself, was we saw a lot of initiatives and apps, and over the last years, that were sold saying, this will help you with anxiety, this will help you with stress, or this chatbot will help you, will give you the best resources. And then when we were asking the question then, and trying to investigate, all right, is this information available on their website, in the guidelines, in the apps, and so forth, it was almost impossible to find this basic piece of information that is minimally required when you submit a paper, when you do your research. I think this whole pandemic has also shown that something that could be considered like a solid piece of evidence can the next morning be considered completely irrelevant, or even unethical, or completely bad science? So there is definitely, I think this specific item requires to be humble, because it's just making, I think we are encouraging developers to be as transparent as possible in terms of the evidence that they claim their tool might have, or their AI system might have, to provide as much data, as much information on this specifically. So our point is, it is not always possible, because not everybody comes from, again, a university where the rules are very, very strict on this topic. And we're really trying to suggest that being as transparent as possible and providing as much information as possible that could still be related to the idea of evidence could definitely be a step forward in terms of being ethical, because you're not claiming that you have an efficient tool, or that you have an evidence-based tool, if you don't provide the information to justify your affirmation. So that was mostly the rationale behind that.
Yeah, thank you, Carl. Yeah, I share your point of view. Out of curiosity, you mentioned, that's the very last question, really. You mentioned Thomas Metzinger, this philosopher that he was talking about ethical washing. Did I get it correctly that he was part of the high-level expert group?
Yes, I can. Let me. So, as you can see, sorry. Okay. Yeah, he was a member of the expert group. Absolutely. So I added the link to that. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so yes, I added the link to that, and I thought it was interesting because there were also other articles or articles or just columns in some papers about how they thought that these guidelines, EU guidelines, were heavily influenced by the private sector, and that it was too complacent with the private sector. So it was interesting to see that it was heavily debated. Whereas when you come from North America, once again, where there are very few rules in some states or in some provinces, it is interesting to see the differences of perspective. And in California, they have this interesting initiative where it comes from the private sector. A lot of companies felt the need of creating their own privacy commissioner office, then to make it as independent as they think it should be. But there is definitely a need. And so I think Metzinger's criticism is something interesting, because it still reminds us to keep us on our toes, and be careful with and be aware that we can cite the EU guidelines and still be criticized for citing them. So there's no universal rule for that.
So thank you, Carl, for a very interesting lecture. Thank you for all the attendees.
Thank you all.
And the questions. It was a pleasure having you. It's great that technology allows to have somebody from Canada giving a lecture, so really nice.
Thank you for being very accepting.
And I wish everybody an excellent rest of the day.
Have a great day, and if you have any questions, you have my email address. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carl.